Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to start the day with you here at 10 a.m. Dubai time, but also 7 a.m. Berlin time. So from wherever you're joining us, maybe from Germany, thank you so much for joining us here at the COP28, here in the German Climate Pavilion. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for making the time on a Sunday morning at a busy COP28 for joining us. Well, we have a topic that is really busily debated, of course, when we talk about the urgent need to scale up the green investment in the global south. Developing and emerging countries, as we all know, they are facing this substantial investment gap, and we come into the numbers in a second as well. And we do have this debate often here at the COP28. It's a very hot debated debate, and when it comes to completing the transformation towards net zero and achieving the mitigation and adaptation goals for the Paris Agreement, we need to talk about the topic of how we mobilize private capital, how we strengthen domestic financial resources for climate action. And what do we need for that? So we need to talk about instruments. We need to talk about the to-dos. And just recently we had a press conference here at the German Climate Pavilion by the KfW, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation, and the Ministry for Climate Action. And the number is tremendous, 27 trillion US dollars, 27 trillion US dollars are needed as investment because we have this huge investment gap when it comes to climate protection. So in order to gear up, we have to speed up as well by 30% in this marathon. And then when we look into our today's topic, we are living in these times we are living in times of polycrisis, in times of multiple crises. We are very busy in keeping everything on track on the same time. So how do we focus then in that regard also in closing the financial gap? And this question will keep us busy now in the next hour. So how to strengthen domestic financial resource mobilization when our attention are everywhere in this marathon. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Katie Gallos. I'm the moderator of the next hour, and I'm looking forward also to your questions. I do see a lot of familiar faces. I do see a lot of experts here in the room, and also I'm pleased to have you joined here, ladies and gentlemen, in the live stream. So please also send your questions via Slido. I welcome now on stage for the official opening remarks, State Secretary in the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, Jochen Flassbart.
Thanks, Kati, for your lively kickoff here. Brings us all into the discussion. Music at this time in the morning on a Sunday might be also a little bit less dramatic, as Ulrich and I just said. I'm from the generation in Germany where had a specific componist, James Last. He had swinging classic. It was much more moderate for a Sunday morning. So. Happy to have you all here on this important topic on strengthening domestic financial resource mobilization in times of polycrisis. And I want to start with this COP here. I don't know who is involved in the negotiations or sometimes listens into the rooms. Wherever you enter, it's about finance. Is it mitigation or adaptation, loss and damage, just transition? All these different negotiations track each and every time it comes to the issue of finance. And when I moved from environment, the Ministry for Environment 2 years ago, to development, I came from Glasgow. It was just after Glasgow. And there we already had the discussions about the 100 billion, and I worked on the 100 billion delivery plan and saw that we have a substantial problem on the climate finance. And then when I came to development, I said, it's even worse. Because if you look at the 2030 agenda, then you can add to the 700 trillion some more money to achieve all the 2030 agenda targets. And it is so obvious that this is not doable with public money, even if the state secretaries for environment and development and climate would be heroes, superheroes. They would not get this money from their ministers for finance, impossible. So obviously we need to look at other sources. And I did two things in the ministry. We established a task force on overall development finance to look at innovative approaches. Not everything brand new. Many people around there who thought already a lot about how to organize development finance. But to sort it a bit out and to look at the most beneficial approaches that we might use on development finance. On climate finance, I think in January or February this year, I established a friends group, Friends of Climate Finance. You're luckily, gratefully, I'm part of this group. Samir Saram also, thanks to both of you, a very interesting group gathered together from universities, think tanks, stakeholders, working under Chatham House rules and trying to bring the best and freshest and ideas together. And one of the issues we discussed was also the one we identified for the climate finance, different areas to operate on, and one is domestic finance mobilization. Ulrich worked on that, and we also thought about the COP, and this was when this side event was created, and I'm so happy that you are ready to share your insights with us, and that we later on can get a deeper dive during the discussion. I think it's absolute essential that we look at the private sector, but that we do not do it only on the international level, but that we also look at the national circumstances. There is a provision in the Paris Agreement, the famous Article 2(1)(c). Not everybody likes it, but if you put all the ideology aside, then it is simply as that if you don't set the right framework on the national level, you will not find the right environment for investors to come in. And that is something we need to discuss about, and that just the surface, the deeper dive will be done in a minute. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And of course, now we're going to dive into a scientific paper. And with us is for that talking about domestic resource mobilization and depth, the one and only Ulrich Volz. Thank you so much. You're the professor at the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS at the University of London, but you're also, of course, within the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, known as IDOS, very actively engaged when it comes to climate finance.
Well, good morning. Thanks so much for having me. So we've got some slides. And I'll first talk briefly about the limits to mobilizing international private capital. I'll then highlight the need to strengthen domestic financial resource mobilization, before then emphasizing the critical role that public development banks can play in this process. And at the end, I'll very briefly touch on the potential of digital solutions to help domestic financial resource mobilization. And this was actually the agenda I wanted to show. So, first of all, as much as we need to reinforce efforts to mobilize international private capital for development and climate action, we also need to get real about the limits we're facing here. A lot of SDG-relevant and climate-relevant investment will not create positive cash flows or not high enough to meet risk-adjusted return expectations of international private financiers. If we are honest, the billions to trillions approach has not really delivered. The track record of project-based de-risking as a way of leveraging small amounts of public money to achieve trillion-dollar transformations is rather poor. And if we take a sober look at the numbers for blended finance, the total blended deal volume actually decreased by approximately 45% in 2022 and about 55% in climate blended finance. So that's a 10-year low in total financing. And unfortunately, we are now at a point where the global financial cycle has turned and international capital is partly retreating from developing countries. And a lot of developing countries, more than 50, are facing severe sovereign debt problems. And a lot of countries, in fact, will need to have their debt restructured before they can start growing again and before private capital will flow into these countries again. Yeah? And so we need to be clear and honest about that. Delaying a solution to the debt crisis will increase the cost of debt restructurings and actually make the Agenda 2030 and also the climate goals unachievable in many developing countries. Yeah? So that's a rather bleak background when we talk about international private capital mobilization. So let me now turn to the need to strengthening domestic financial resource mobilization. So there's been a lot of talk about shifting the trillions into developing countries, but as a matter of fact, a lot of capital is actually flowing uphill. That is, it's flowing in the wrong direction from developing countries to advanced countries. And a significant portion of the savings of developing emerging countries is invested, and often at low or negative returns, in the financial centers of advanced countries. And many emerging market and developing economies, especially in Asia and also the Middle East, have been running current account surpluses, which means they have been exporting capital on a net basis, building up very sizable overseas assets and also foreign exchange reserves. But even African countries that are net capital importers, they also do export a lot of capital, which then partly is flowing back, but at much worse terms, and often in the form of high-yielding debt or portfolio investment, which is also adding to financial vulnerabilities. And that is foreign currency lending. And if we want to look at the causes of the debt crisis, that's one of the reasons. And we've done a lot of number crunching. And so the magic number I want to throw at you is $10 trillion. So basically, over the last decades, emerging market developing economies, excluding China, built up net foreign and reserve assets to the amount of $10 trillion. So that's a lot of money that, at least in part, could have been used to finance domestic development and, of course, climate action. And one major reason, not the only one, but one major reason for these capital exports is the lack of safe investable assets in many of these countries. And this is a problem that needs to get fixed, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Turning to my third point, given that private finance won't do it by itself, we need international, national, and subnational public development banks to play a much larger role in financing local, regional, and global public goods, and also providing the finance for the structural transformations to low-carbon, sustainable economies that we so urgently need, and also in deepening local capital markets to mobilize domestic savings. But we need to equip public development banks to do so, both at the international level and at the national level. And this means, A, pressing ahead with MDB reform, including capital increases, and a lot of good stuff has been happening in that respect more recently. But it also means strengthening national development banks. And let me just emphasize what a critical role public development banks can play in domestic financial resource mobilization, because they have the unique ability, especially the MDBs, to provide safe assets that investors want to hold. So basically, MDBs have a tried and tested model of leveraging private finance by borrowing from international capital markets. If we take 5 large MDBs, so the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the EBRD, with a total paid-in capital of just $50 billion, they have over the last decades lent more than $1.5 trillion for development. So that's a 1 to 30 ratio. And this has been achieved by mobilizing private sector investors through issuing bonds. Yeah? So that's a very successful model of mobilizing private capital, and we need to ramp this up. But instead of only drawing on international capital markets, or mostly drawing on international capital markets, MDBs should also tap local markets, create safe local assets that are currently missing, and provide local currency financing, which again will address the foreign exchange risk problem that is so bad in many countries. And of course, kind of the local currency bond issuances, you can't do that everywhere, but you can help start developing these markets also in the lesser developed countries. And very importantly, we need to unleash the potential also of national development banks to do the same, adopt the same model of mobilizing private capital at the national level. So national development banks can play a key role in developing local currency bond markets and mobilizing domestic savings for domestic investment. But there's one problem. National development banks of developing countries are not backed by a strong sovereign, the same way that KfW is backed by AAA rated Germany. Yeah? Which means that their credit ratings are worse, their cost of capital are much higher. And this is where MDBs and international DFIs like KfW can come in to strengthen national development banks and help. So existing national development banks are also help setting up new development banks. And there are 2 key issues that MDBs and DFIs can do to strengthen national development banks. First is they can help to strengthen mandates, governance, build up technical capacities for climate finance and so on. And that's important, but the second part is as important, and that is MDBs and DFIs, they can provide equity or callable capital, or alternative, provide guarantees so that national banks are stronger and can issue local currency debt at lower cost than they can do now. And so this is basically about empowering national development banks to play a much more forceful role, mobilize domestic savings by issuing local currency bonds, providing relatively safe assets, and that does not only mitigate the problem of the capital outflows that I mentioned before, but also reduces dependency on foreign currency financing. And I'm coming to the end now. but that's a point that's very close to my heart. When discussing domestic financial resource mobilization, we should also look at novel digital solutions, because they have provided a lot of opportunity to reinvent capital market infrastructure and develop new innovative fundraising approaches that can also be used by public development banks to attract a new investor base. And that's critical for mobilizing domestic savings. So, for example, asset tokenization enables issuers to issue smaller amounts and household, small retail investors to buy small units of these assets in a very cost-efficient manner. And we have some great examples for that already. For example, already in 2017, the government of Kenya issued so-called Emakiba bonds, which are basically savings bonds that can be bought in small denomination, 3,000 Kenyan shilling, that's around $30. So it's a small amount where even kind of average households can become investors. The Emakiba example is a nice example. It did not fully unleash its potential, I would say, but the model itself is fantastic. And we've seen similar approaches being explored, for example, in Thailand, where the government issued one baht bonds, or recently in Singapore, which of course is not a developing country, where the government of Singapore, via the Monetary Authority of Singapore, issued green infrastructure savings bonds, again, that could be bought in small denomination at ATMs, via mobile banking, and via the internet. So these are actually not super sophisticated ways, but innovative ways how you can tap new investor groups, you can mobilize domestic savings, and that's what we need to really do much, much more. So I think development banks, international ones, but also national ones, can play a really important role in unleashing the domestic potential. And with this, I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Uli.
And I should say that we're publishing actually a report on that early next year, but there is an executive summary which you can download if you manage to scan this QR code. Thank you.
Thank you, Uli. Stay with me on stage, please. Don't run away. We still need you and your expertise. Thank you. We leave the QR code again for another second here on screen. So if you want to take a quick photograph, that's your chance. And then, of course, do I get a thumbs up if everybody took a photo? Yeah? Because there's one more slide. If you get in touch with Uli, that's his email address. Great. Thank you. Now we start into our panel debate, and Uli is already on stage, and I kindly invite our panelists now to come on stage. We have Jochen Flassbart again joining us, Christiane Leibach, Patricia Ojangole, Admase Tadesse, and Samir Zaha. Admase, would you join me here on that side? And Samir, may I ask you to sit next to me? Beautiful. And I used a little cube here. No, that's very kind, thank you. I'll do a quick round of introduction before we start into our conversation. And again, it's the kind invitation towards you. Give me a hand sign if you have any questions. And also, ladies and gentlemen in live stream, Slido is still switched on. I do have another pad here, so please send your questions along. From left to right, of course, we know Uli already, we know Jochen Flassbart already. Also with us is Christiane Leibach. You are the member of the executive board at KfW. You are responsible for international finance within the Development Bank Business Division and also the subsidiary DEG, and export and project financing at KfW IPEX banks, and you held various positions at DEG and, of course, KfW. Thank you so much for joining us and, of course, bringing the perspective of KfW into our debate. Next to you, it's also a big honor to having you on the panel in these busy times. Patricia Ojangole, you're the managing director of the Uganda Development Bank, and you have played a pivotal role in the institution's consistent growth and rebuilding when it comes to stakeholder confidence. And you also bring a big experience in the development financial sector, not just here on stage, but especially, of course, in the Ugandan financial landscape. Thank you. Also, a warm welcome to you, Mr. Admasu Tadese. You're the President Emeritus and Managing Director of the Eastern Southern African Trade and Development Bank since 2011. So under your leadership, the bank has received numerous awards, as I read, among the best trade finance bank in Kenya and Ethiopia, and the title of African Bank of the Year. And we want to hear all about it, all your secrets that we need to learn. Thank you so much for being here. And last but not least, also, of course, a warm welcome to you, Samir Saran. You are the president of the Observer Research Foundation based in India. This is an Indian think tank, headquartered, of course, in New Delhi, and your research focuses on issues of global governance, climate change, and energy policy, technology and media, and India's foreign policy, so it's a broad nexus. You're also the chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Geopolitics, and on the Risks Advisory Board as well. You're writing a lot of books, you're author of several books and academic publications. Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. Uli mentioned already a few to-dos and a few chapters, of course, of the new report. And I'd like to start now with the first round when we talk about investments for climate action when it comes to the local economy. And Patricia, of course, I'd like to start with you, bringing straight away your perspective on stage when it comes to the to-dos. I mean, we've listened to Uli already, what is necessary, but we also want to hear more from you. What are the challenges and the barriers that especially developing countries face when it comes to mobilizing domestic savings for local investment, especially towards, of course, sustainable and climate development?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I think I'll speak in the context of Africa. I think that's where I have a bit of experience. And when it comes to mobilizing domestic finance, I think one of the key challenges is there's still low levels of savings. Most of African economies still have a large informal sector. So you don't have resources coming through the formal financial systems. And the savings to GDP ratio on average on the continent is still low at 18%. So I think ways need to be done to scale up domestic savings through the formal systems so those savings can be channeled to investments. The other challenge is there is government borrowing from the private sector, from the commercial banks. So that essentially crowds out the private sector. What we have seen, for example, in the past few years is commercial bank credit to government increasing, while credit to the private sector reducing. So that's quite an interesting trend, and that is because of the, better, risk profile of, government investment. So the commercial banks, which also in the case of my country, for example, constitute about 80% of the banking industry assets, prefer, to take risk-free investments, and therefore lending money to government becomes more attractive to them than lending to the private sector. So obviously that situation is compounded by the fact that there is low development of the capital markets. And I think this is one of the areas that, economies in development countries have to see how to deepen, the role of the capital markets. And I think for me, it is one of the priorities that even though at policy level we're looking at how do you increase capital flows, I think that potential is yet to be exploited, and I think it should be done. I think I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank Thank you. Advisor, when we talk about capital markets and of course strengthening these capital markets in the need when it comes to climate-friendly and sustainable investments, so what needs to be done from your perspective when we talk about our question of today? How do we strengthen domestic financial resource mobilization and also the capital market situation?
I think the microphone prefers Patricia's voice.
I think... Okay, so we're using Patricia's microphone, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Delighted to be here with everybody else. I think Patricia kicked off really nicely because she highlighted some of the systemic issues, really, which has to do with the macro aspect of this discussion. You can't get away from the savings issue. That's like a fundamental issue. But then you have meso and micro level issues too. So when you talk about capital markets, that's a meso-level institutional issue which can be tackled in its own right, even though it will always be constrained by macro variables. So what could always be done at the meso level is do the things that you can do institutionally. So that is come up with institutional framework. I think Professor Ulrich talked quite a bit about institutional frameworks. So regardless of what's happening at the macro level, you can always build the capital market regulation, the various rules, the institutions, the authority that would then overlook the whole space. And then, of course, you'll need to have an exchange put in there. The exchange has to work. And at the corporate level, exchanges are corporates in their own right. They need to have good technology. They need to have good governance. They need to have the right people running them. So, you know, those are easily doable at the institutional level, right?
What do we do if we don't have all these to-dos?
Well, I can tell you, I'm not just talking to this topic as the head of the Trade and Development Bank. I happen to be the chairman of Financial Sector Deepening Ethiopia. Ethiopia is one country that was not on the slide that Professor Ulrich put up when he talked about some of these institutions being present in some countries. Ethiopia is trying to catch up with many of the East African economies and certainly the South African spaces. And so we've built now a framework. We've launched the Capital Market Authority of Ethiopia. And we've also established the exchange. This is FSD, which is funded by FCDO together with the Gates Foundation. We have a team in Addis that works very closely with FSD Africa based in Nairobi. And we've been doing a great deal building the institution at the meso level, right? So this is really where nobody can complain that they can't do anything. You know, you can tackle the meso level independently of the macro and the micro. Of course, once you do set it up, then there's a whole question. I mean, you have a mature exchange in countries like Kenya. You have an East Africa authority as well. And the problem with some of these exchanges is there just isn't enough activity. So you don't have the liquidity, you don't have the turnover. So this brings you to the micro level, where now the corporates have to start being active on the exchanges, right? So they need to start issuing, obviously, equity. They need to issue local currency bonds. And so there's that dynamic. So there's always that interplay of three different levels. And the good news, I think, for different role players is you do have a certain amount of freedom to take action at each level on its own. But they are interrelated. So the extent to which you can move and get things done will be constrained by the other dimensions. We've had a lot of success. Maybe just a word or two. I mean, we happen to be a hard currency denominated bank. We were created to complement the national development banks, who tend to be local currency denominated. And we're kind of in between the national DFIs and the African Development Bank, which is continental. But the design character had us dollar-based. So we have that reality we have to live with, and that ensures we complement the national DFIs, because we were not created to compete with national development banks, but we are sort of mezzanine level DFI. But that's not stopped us from trying to do as much as we can in the local currency space. So we've issued local currency bonds, we've issued guarantees to intermediaries within these countries, both microfinance institutions, banks, taking portfolio risk alongside these players who operate in local currency. We back them up and we enable them to do much more than they would do had they just gone it on their own. And so we sit with our dollar balance sheet at the mezzanine level, but we throw our weight behind these various players who can do much more. So there's that kind of room that you have to maneuver, and it ties up with some of the things that Professor Ulrich talked about, which is really, not coming in with hard currency all the time, maximizing your risk instruments, which don't have that currency mismatch, right? You're just there in the event of a materialization of risk, and then you disperse and you take your share of the risk. So there is quite a bit of room to maneuver. I think the final analysis will always be constrained by the fact that there just isn't enough surplus in the local currency space. You look at AAA rated MDBs like the World Bank Group, they try also to issue local currency bonds. So does the African Development Bank. But there's the reality that Patricia spoke about. If you're a pension fund in Uganda, and the government of Uganda issues or wants to borrow versus a AAA rated institution globally that comes and issues a bond, the risk-return relationship doesn't make sense. So if you're a local Ugandan institutional investor, you would always prefer to buy the government security because it's AAA rated at the local level. But the global guys coming in with AAA at a global USD level or Euro level will come in and say, we're much higher rated than the Ugandan government. We should get a much better return. We should get a discount in terms of risk. But you have a floor there, right? So there are these paradoxes in a sense, and it just proves that we can play around the local currency space, but there's a lot of constraints. I think just one point to leave with the House is to say, with all these debt issues that are coming, something that could be very interesting in this polycrisis time is to move the needle, right? Is to say, if there are foreign development partners who are willing to entertain debt swaps, right? So you do a debt for nature, a debt for climate, a debt for SDG swap. So you'll go to a government and you say, you know what? You have difficulty repaying a forex obligation. Why don't we swap it? Pay me in local currency. You take that local currency, put it in either Uganda Development Bank, put it into a trust, put it into a special facility and on-lend it. And you on-lend it for whatever purpose the sponsor is interested in. You could be agriculturally motivated, you could be health related. Anyhow, I've said too much. Thank you.
No, I was thinking that. No, thank you. No. We go into that depth of in a second. I think it's an important keyword. Just let me keep in and bring in also, of course, Samia to our debate. You mentioned that an interplay of different levels, and of course, coming from a think tank perspective, Dr. Samia Saran, I'd like to hear from you. How can, when we work on a multilateral level, and also from your policy-making experience, how can multilateral development banks and development finance institutions help to overcome these different levels and this need for interplay of several levels?
This works, yeah. No, first of all, let me congratulate Ulrich on the presentation. I think you ticked every box. And maybe we could have emphases on certain other elements as well. But this is pretty much the landscape that we are experiencing today. And while I'm a big believer in putting together an architecture that allows us to create the competence, the mandates, the capacities to leverage what exists alongside international partnerships, that was the last, I think, pretty much the second last slide. I also believe that fundamentally there are two big drivers that need to be triggered before we can really deploy at scale, finance at scale. And I'm going to respond to you very quickly on the multilateral international architecture, but I just wanted to pick on Ulrich's presentation. I think first, the point that everyone has restated, I'm just going to restate it again, is savings, right? Now, savings rates is one thing, and India is 29%. It's perhaps the highest in the world, barring China, in the developing world. China appropriates savings, so they should not be counted in that evaluation. But outside of China, the largest saving rates probably in the developing emerging world is India, 29%. But that is not the point. The point is not the level of savings, and this is, I think, we all need to understand. How much of it are financialized savings? And that is only between 5 to 10% depending on different regions of the country. So you are seeing a single-digit financial saving, which is basically the capital that is available for us to use for development or other purposes, in the infrastructure, development, climate action, industry, whatever you want to use it for. So money in your home is not equal to money available with the nation to respond to challenges. I think that's the first part. Now, the digital slide, Ulrich, was phenomenal. Now, let me give you something that no one knows about India. Everyone knows about India's financial transformation, the fintech sector, the digital payment sector, right? 40% of all global digital payments happen in India today. There's nothing that we do which is 5x of China other than digital payments. In digital payments, we are really doing well. Now, everyone knows this story. The second story that no one knows about, but was triggered alongside this digital payment revolution, is that till 2016, India had assets under management, mutual funds, insurance, etc., growing at the rate of India's GDP. So if GDP grew by 6 to 7% or 8%, assets under management grew by 6 to 7 to 8%. Post this digital revolution, and that's the point I just want to emphasize, the one you made, post this digital revolution, assets under management in India are growing 2x of GDP. So at less than $1 a month of systematic investment plans that are now available to everyone in India who's on a mobile phone, our assets under management class is really rapidly growing. Now, what does it really mean? It means that today government has a tax to GDP ratio, and this is the second point I want to make. So one, how do you convert savings into financial savings? And technology is certainly one route to go. We are doubling our assets under management vis-a-vis the GDP growth rate every year, courtesy technology. I know the Germans find digitalization impossible, but we in Kenya and India love it. So yes, technology can be one way of creating larger financial pools of capital available for development. So that's my first point. The second is, and this is again something that none of us wants to speak about in the global south. We have atrocious tax to GDP ratios. India is, center and state governments together are 17%. The federal government is barely 11%. The federal government borrows another 10% just to meet its bills. So Indian government spends 20% of our GDP every year in any case. Now please understand, the 20% of Indian GDP would mean $600 billion or $800 billion. So it has a budget of $800 billion, half of it borrowed, half of it collected through tax revenues. And out of this $800 billion, 10% is spent on salaries and defense and investment incentives for industry, etc. And 10% is spent on development activities. So imagine, is India behaving like a country that has a $400 billion development budget? It is not, because it is dispersed so thinly across such a large population and such large number of territories without the centralized architecture of a development financial institution. KFW has worked with many of them. You have worked with SIDBI, you have worked with NABARD. I don't have to tell the Germans about India's development landscape. They've been developing India before India developed itself. So, it's been a long journey. And most of them don't have hair anymore because we were partners with them. They pulled their hair out trying to work with us. So that's, the Germans understand what I'm talking about. But now what a centralized architecture, a development financial institution can really do is get the muscles of a $400 billion development budget. A $400 billion development budget with a $BBB rating and a gearing ratio of 8 to 10 can deliver $2.5 to $3 trillion of development finance in an ideal world. On paper, with $400 billion, I could certainly create $2.5 to $3 trillion of crowding in of finance for development activities, which can meet my climate requirements and which can meet my development. On theory. In politics, that is not possible because you have niche, segmented requirements. Certain people are not interested in agricultural issues. Some are not interested in drought issues. Some are not interested in the cyclones and hurricanes that terrify our East Coast every year. So we cannot use that entire might of $400 billion. We end up with very small pockets of money available with multiple institutions. A couple of decades ago, we had 2 development institutions. Today, we probably have 100. If you start listing even the development initiatives which have large pools of money. So we have divided most of our countries for meeting our own political economy dynamics, have divided money to suit the democratic demands of various constituencies, which is important in a democracy. And therefore, we have to be clever. We cannot build a development financial institution through the European lens. We have to build it through a clever 21st century architecture where we have these multiple institutions doing different serving different sectors and different constituencies and different peoples controlled by different political interest groups. And yet we have a common architecture on top that in many ways aggregates this 400 billion into one pile of money and is able to create common mandates, common norms, common principles, and common partnerships with international institutions who want to partner with us. And I think that's the second thing that digital allows us to do. And India has begun to do that. It's called the Gati Shakti project, where we are taking multiple schemes of the government and aggregating it virtually into one single schemata that we are offering to folks in Abu Dhabi, folks in Saudi Arabia, folks in Norway and other sovereign wealth funds who now look at India on one screen rather than going to different offices. So I think technology will have to help us create an aggregated development financial institution in the emerging and developing countries that allows us to negotiate with the larger world. Sorry, I didn't answer your question, but it was a long answer.
I repeat my question quickly because then we focus on your side as well. I asked
MDBs, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now I think this is the point. Africa and India both have the development challenge, but both African countries and India are part of new and old MDB, have rather been deep partners of old MDBs and are architects of new development banks that are coming up. The African Development Bank, the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Bank. India is a part of a few that have come in, right? So I think a development financial architecture at the national level, that national layer allows us to actually work with the MDBs in doing two things that Ulrich mentioned. Reduce currency risks, and that is very, very important when you're dealing with international finance. And I think the single most important duty of a development financial institution that looks after this large landscape has to be de-risk currency for international donors or investors or funders. And I think that's one task that this bank can do. And the second has to be the gearing that Ulrich was speaking about, that how can we leverage, actually how can we shop for international partnerships. There are so many opportunities today that we are all in a marketplace of development. There is so much misery around the world that it is the single most competitive sector today. Everyone is miserable. Misery has competition today. So the development banks will have, the national development banks will have to be the single point of coordination with MDBs so that we can actually crowd in their capital into us. Since you asked this, they will also have to partner with the MDBs. Look, what we demand of the World Bank, we have to also demand of ourselves. If we want the World Bank to work with the private sector, if we want the World Bank to work with, to be more efficient and smarter in deployment of the capital, to gear up better, we should be demanding that of ourselves as well. So I think we have to learn with the MDBs on leveraging the own capital at home. 2% of all profit after tax of Indian corporation goes into development work. It is random, it is sporadic, it is ad hoc. Much of it is corporate PR. Very little of it goes into real substantive development outcomes that the country seeks. I think the national development banks should also capture that layer, the private sector layer that is deploying huge amount of capital on largely prestige projects or narcissistic projects. We need them to be development projects because that was the original mandate of creating the compulsory contribution of 2%. So lots of work for MDBs and NDBs, sorry.
Thank you, Samir. There are a lot of to-dos and lots of work, as you mentioned. Jochen and Christiane, I'd like to come to you, Christiane, as well. When we talk about, and you just mentioned, Samir, the new development banks, of course, the role of the multilateral development bank sector. How can we strengthen their role, and how can we raise, of course, the need for low-cost capital on these several levels that we mentioned? Of course, we always talk in a broad sense, but maybe you can share with us your perspective from the German perspective, the KfW, and what are your thoughts to the previous speakers? What comes to your mind? I think it's switched on. Oh yeah, they got it from.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. A very interesting insight here, and I think what it shows to me, even from an overall economic perspective, and as well as on a systematic and organizational perspective, we understand very quickly how much intertwined are things in a way. And let me make one last remark from my side on the low savings rate. I mean, when we talk about in development policies about financial inclusion, we sometimes tend to look only from the perspective that we want to have inclusion for poorer groups of people, for women or whatever, but we tend to forget what it means for the economy in itself, because financial inclusion means at the same time that we formalize savings and make the local markets more liquid and make the local markets more tend to really be able to invest into assets and into development asset of a specific country. And I think that's a thought we shouldn't forget, and which became clear to me again here in this discussion. Yeah, but now more on the systematic approach. I mean, looking a bit back on KfW's own histories, and we turned 75 years this year, I think development banks in themselves are part of the ecosystem as well. So it's not that it is only talk about how to shape a development bank or promotional bank at its best, but we have to think about what really the role they play in an economy. And we shouldn't forget the private sector, because a development bank very often can only work very efficiently if they really use themselves, the private sector, work closely with the private sector, really to come to this gearing, to come really to the leverage that is needed. Yeah, and what we have been learning from our own experience is that I think good governance is absolutely key. Yeah, because I mean, development banks which have a government, a country as a 100% shareholder, I think if there is not a very good governance, I think they can tend to be instruments of politics, and then it can get pretty bad in a way, because then it's not, or might not anymore really what is on the priority for the country and the people of the country. That's one thing. And the other thing is really to find clearly the role, what kind of focus and what kind of program a certain development should play. And that's how I understood you, in particular in a larger country as India, where we have different organization, and it's a lot about architecture and who plays which role, which I think is very, very important. What have we been doing as KfW, and that was always our thinking when we, in our relations with national and regional development banks, first of all, I think we are very convinced that they play a key role, that they have a lot of leverage to cross, to bridge kind of to bridge the international markets with the local markets and play a role in their specific countries. We know that finance is important, but our strategy was always to combine that with really sharing know-how and expertise, how really to best set up a development bank. We have been doing that in terms of advisory in a lot of countries, like, for example, in Uganda and in other African countries. And so I think it is not only about finance, but it is about sharing knowledge and experience, how to get it best done, and how to include the private sector, because that's actually what we all tend to as national and in particular international development banks, is really how to include the private sector in really mobilizing the private sector. What is our role to play? And I think there it is a lot about risk sharing, it is about de-risking, it is about, for example, when it comes to local currencies, to bridge the foreign to the local currency. So what we are looking for and what we have been developing is really instruments that exactly are in the focus of these challenges I was just describing. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe you can share with us later on a project, of course, that is elaborating that. But first of all, I'd like to bring in Jochen. Jochen, you are following several COPs in your whole career. And as you just mentioned, in every room here at the COP28, finance topics is a hot topic, right? And when you just listen to what is needed and where we are, and of course the need of bringing in also the public sector, how would you look now at the COP28? Is there any movement towards the right direction when it comes to climate finance and to mobilize this huge capital that we need?
Well, let me put it that way. It doesn't get into this complexity. The discussions are much broader. Some are focused on the budget, and also a budget dollar or euro is a real dollar. Others understand that we need to involve private sectors, that we need to leverage. And I think there is an increasing agreement on that one. But the complexity that is reflected here, or when I listen in our meetings to the Friends group, is not internalized in these debates here. And I would like to broaden it a bit from this COP here to development policies. I thought in the past it was maybe just a German approach, but I realized, discussing it with colleagues around the world, that it is in general a deficit in development policy to look at the finance sector, or the financing, let's put it like that, just as a tool. So we as a ministry tasked KfW or a UN entity or MDB to run a program or a project for us. And we have to get to another layer. And that is what we did on the World Bank when we took office, Svenja Schulze, our minister, is a governor there, to realize that it's our bank and that we have to play a role, not in a way that we are dictating others, but that we are creative, that we are listening to others. And that was a starting point when Svenja Schulze and Janet Yellen started. We need to have this World Bank reform. It's now done. I think an important step has been done, also to increase the possibility for lending, but also with a focus on the global public goods. I have some doubt that this is the last step. Much more is to be done. We already started to extending the debate from our side to the regional development banks, where we also need to play a role. I understood from the recent debates during the last months, but also here on the podium, that there is also a need to link it to the national development banks. And my point is that we have to get out of a development cooperation attitude that is project and program fixed. If we don't get into this level of debate, and sorry, although I'm an economist, I will never understand everything what you are saying here, because you are the experts. But what I understand is, if we don't get to the level of focusing our development cooperation on some of the sensitive issues where we as development politicians can make a difference, then we will not reach our overall targets. And one part of that is looking at the issue of the interest rates and the ratings. Many of our partners say, well, this is, on the political level, this is north-south unfair issue. Our access to finance is much more costly. But this is not made by me or by the German Chancellor or by President Macron. This is done by the rating agencies. And maybe there is an incorrect risk perception, but then we have to identify what does it make to get this to this wrong or not full risk perception. The other issue, and then I will stop, is can we do something from our development cooperation side to address some key issues to increase the rating of our partner countries. Governance has been mentioned, corruption, fragility, all these things. But this has been seen, for example, the fragility issue has been seen as a fragility issue, but not as a precondition to address it, also to increase the risk, rating of a country, and therefore make it easier to get access to finance markets. I stop here.
Thank you. I do see some nodding. I'm curious where you agree and where you disagree, but maybe we start with Uli, and then I would love to come back to you, Uli.
I actually,
Closer to them, yes,
Yeah.
because we have a little bit of background music here.
I actually agree very much with Jochen and pretty much everything that's been said on the panel, which is kind of boring from a kind of vivid discussion perspective. But I think addressing the systemic structural challenges, I mean, without trying that, we're just not going to get anywhere. Yeah? So just providing kind of development loans can be nice, but it's not going to change anything structurally. So we really need to see how can we use very sparse public development finance to bring about structural change. And so everyone here has basically highlighted the point I made in the presentation about strengthening domestic savings and, very importantly, putting them to good use. And this means we need to develop markets. We need to shape markets.
Who is we?
We, well, everyone here. But so markets don't just develop by themselves. Yeah? So we need, of course, private market actors to play their role. We need private cooperation and so on. We need private financial institutions. They are vital. But, and I didn't have much time to go into that in my presentation, but these markets really need to be nurtured. They need to be developed. To simplify a little bit, in a lot of developing countries, we have banking systems where banks have a very nice model, which is working well for them, but it's not really delivering outcomes that we need for the economy. Yeah? So they mop up some savings, but they pay low interest rates to domestic savers, so also not providing a lot of incentive to put the money into the bank. And then a lot of the financing actually goes to governments. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And it's a very lucrative business. If the government pays high interest rate, and the bank pays low deposit rates, and then there's a big margin, and SME financing, all that is just not a very attractive business. A lot of work, not great returns. And so we have banking systems often that just not deliver on what the economy needs, what the country needs. And so we need to develop these markets, and we also need to develop capital markets. And I think public development banks have a critical role in helping to develop these markets. That doesn't mean they should be taking over and just do everything themselves. They should be working with private institutions, and as markets develop, we can also scale down, in relative terms, the role of public institutions. But we need to develop the markets. And very importantly, on the international dimension, I'm a little bit frustrated. There's been so many great impulses coming from the Bridgetown Initiative. But one of the key takeaways, apparently now, is that we need to de-risk international lending. And this really makes me mad, because we need to be trying to reduce reduce foreign currency lending. We don't need very expensive hedging of foreign exchange lending. We need to increase local currency lending. And the MDBs actually, they themselves, they should be managing also currency risk. Yeah? I can go on, but I won't.
Now let's talk about frustration, because of course, we are very aware of the big need of what we just talked about. But Patricia and Admas, Where is your frustration point when we talk about our topic of today, when it comes to climate finance, Patricia and then Admesu? Where is also maybe the blind spot that we don't see because we talk in our silos and in our bubbles?
Thank you. Maybe I will also touch on just a few other issues that have been said. And I think the realities are real. First, there are issues of, risk, risk profiles of specific countries. So, for example, as UDBL, we have a national rating, Fitch, AAA. But our country has a B+, positive outlook. So when it comes to issues around raising capital or other interventions, we cannot be considered, outside the sovereign. So that is kind of an inherent, risk. And this is where partnerships kind of come into play. And we've talked about how MDBs, can support national development banks and the critical role that they can play. And being a national development bank, we have the potential to convene everyone and work through them because we understand government, government policy. We support the private sector. Mm-hmm. Like in our case, we actually implement government policy through the private sector. So you have to understand, both worlds, but we cannot do that alone. We would need to work together to create, for example, pipelines that can attract the private sector and be able to mobilize funding. My experience sitting where I am is funding is actually not a problem. Money is there. And we have got people come, MDBs come telling us we are looking for projects, And so now you have to find a way of how can we create the projects that we can also use to catalyze private investment, even through the capital markets. And that is one of the things that we are doing. The other thing that we've not talked about is the cost of credit. Because again, what we've realized is that funding is available, but it would come at a high cost. And of course, look at the private sector that we support, and specifically our government is pursuing a private sector-led, kind of development approach. So when you talk to a private sector, one of the challenges that we always talk about is the cost of credit. And that is why our government, for example, is using the National Development Bank as a policy bank to address that issue that we believe is a key policy concern in the country currently. So when it really comes to where I think the key challenges or the pain points are, I believe that if we put our acts together, identify the right partners, work with everybody, I believe whatever seems to be a challenge would be dealt with. And I think the challenge is lack of capital, We need capital to flow. So how do we arrange and organize ourselves to enable capital to flow to investments? Thank you.
Thank you. Admesu, I come back to you now, because when we talk about capital flows, of course, how do we leverage the much needed capital also within Africa, within the continent, not just from the global north to global south or vice versa, but also within the continent? And where's also, talking about frustration points, where's your frustration point in the debate, also when we talk about the involvement of the private sector? Are we already on the right path, or should we invite the private sector also in such a panel next time?
Well, maybe let me just first say that this is now December.
A little bit closer, because
most of us have been attending many conferences in 2023. I was at the World Bank meetings, ADB meetings, so many different meetings. And I must say that this panel, I found that the topic today, the kind of systems thinking approach to some of our challenges is very refreshing, honestly. And I think, for me, I find it very, very relevant because it deals with leverage and multiplier effects, right? The piecemeal approach to just working at projects and programs or a credit line here and there is nice. It's good to have at the micro level, but people don't talk about enough the meso and the macro level. I think a collective like the ones we're here today, I think our sweet spot is the meso level, because savings issues, the big issues are always going to be in the sovereign space. We'll have limited, influence there. We can advocate, we can help, and so on. But I think at the meso level here, developing financial sector development, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there that has yet to be extracted. And I mean, he talked about digitization, right? That's a very interesting space. The other thing that's very interesting, I find, is looking at the asset space. Many of these developing countries are asset rich, but that doesn't come out. And the question is, how can you use this huge endowment of assets to maybe convert some of those assets and monetize them and create more financial resources? And that's like something that I find that the UAE is playing a particular role in promoting the development of sovereign wealth funds. Many people, when they hear about a sovereign wealth fund in Egypt and Ethiopia and Kenya, they say, these are poor countries, how can they have sovereign wealth funds? Hello, asset rich. Right? It's not on the balance sheet of the annual flows. GDP is an annual flow. People are not looking at the asset side of the balance sheet. It's huge. And I found that there's a lot there to be done. I mean, we don't have time to go into it, but all I can say is there's a lot of room to play there. But I think the other low-lying fruit at the meso level is, you know, African capital is there, and I found it fascinating how somebody like Ulrich can zero in on some of the points that he raised about so much African capital sitting overseas, right? And it's not there working for Africa. And again, it's like the asset issue. Many people forget that Africa's asset rich. Actually, Africa has trillions of dollars of financial assets. A lot of that is sitting afraid in overseas jurisdictions, like he said. And central banks are part of that, pension funds are. I have stepped into that space and I've gone to pension funds in some of our member states, and I've said to the pension funds, I know you need safety for your pensioners. Your objective is to provide a safe return for pensioners. I'm BBB rated, I can give you a very good return. Instead of putting everything in an offshore jurisdiction, what if I give you a facility or an opportunity to come in, I give you a risk-related return that's very attractive, more attractive than you would have elsewhere. I am investment grade. Why don't you buy some of my products? Today I have 21 institutional investors in my institution that I didn't have 10 years ago. And they've actually now equal with the sovereigns. Talking about attracting private capital. African institutional investors now are a huge stakeholder community for my development bank. I work closely with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, European Investment Bank. They find it fascinating that we've managed to attract so much capital into the capital base of the institution. Not bonds only, but they're participating in the capital of the bank. Now there's a very exciting development around hybrid capital at the G20 level. And it's still, that's my frustration. Now I'm coming to the frustration.
Yeah, where's the headache?
You get these great ideas that are very feasible, very doable, but they're sticky. They don't move, right? Let me give you another example. Special drawing rights at the IMF, right? Very good idea. We know that there is a lot of prospect there. Talk about multiplier effects, right? You know, come to COP, you talk about budget, budget, budget. And as Clinton said, it's not the economy stupid, it's the finance stupid, right? You come to a meeting like this, everybody wants to unlock the money. And you have these massive pools sitting idle. And you have stakeholders sitting so comfortably on massive resources that are idle, nobody wants to move it. Nobody wants to take a little bit of risk. People will come here and be philosopher kings, talk about the issues till the cows come home at night. And you say you're sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars of financial assets that are not being used. What if you took a little bit of risk and on-lent some of that, or find a way to unlock that kind of money? That's my frustration. But I'm an investment-grade financial institution. I can't even attract some of this money, let alone a B-rated development bank in Kenya or in Ethiopia or in Uganda, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of resources out there, but it's almost like it's the pink elephant in the room. People will come and have beautiful debates and have very eloquent conversations, but nobody wants to really move the real money that's out there. Guarantees is not a cost, right? And I think the beautiful point that Ulrich said, callable capital. If you are, say, a G7 country, you know, if you were to come to an entity like TDB and say, I don't want to be a shareholder of too many global MDBs, that's what sometimes I hear. So if you don't want to come and be a shareholder of MDB, what about provide callable capital? I've been banging on the doors of some G7 countries. KfW has been great to us. AFD of France, the UK through BII, all of them great. They give me all the credit lines I need. But I say my constraint is no longer credit, it's risk capital. Who's going to help me scale on that front? And then the question becomes, everybody starts to scratch the... Now all of a sudden the G20 comes up with hybrid capital. I see a beautiful opportunity there. It's not moving, it's stuck. People talking it, nobody's walking the talk.
Uli, do you see the same opportunities in hybrid capital when we talk about what Ahmad just mentioned?
I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can pursue, and I think, the key word that he used was multiplier. So if you have an MDB or DFI, international DFI, that gives him a credit line, there's no real multiplier. If they provide capital or callable capital, that creates a big multiplier effect, because then it enhances his ability to issue more bonds to mop up more savings. Yeah? And the points he made about the actual assets financial assets being available is so important, and a lot of them are indeed sitting outside of these countries. So yes, savings rates are in many countries far too low, but still. So we have almost 80 countries for which which over the last decade on average have shifted around 2% of GDP built up foreign assets annually. Yeah? So 2% of GDP, that's a lot of money. And there's around 30 countries, developing countries, where 5% of GDP has flown out annually as a built-up of foreign capital. Yeah? So there is a lot of capital. We just need to make sure that we mobilize it.
I'll have a look.
Jump in with a final comment.
Final comment, and then just give me a hand sign if you're with us, right? We are still there, you're still there. It's a two-way conversation, so I'm with you in a second, please.
This thing of guarantees, whether it's at the level of credit enhancement to raise money from the private sector or callable capital, I was trying to get some of these types of guarantees, and I couldn't get it from the usual public development banks, from the G7 and the global MDBs. And then somebody gave me an idea and says, why don't you go to Lloyd's of London? They might have more risk appetite than the very DFIs of the G7 countries and the global MDBs. I couldn't believe it. I said, let me give it a try. So I go to London, start talking to Lloyd's of London. They say, sounds innovative. Let's look at the history of your risk materialization. Is it just perception or is it reality? They said, okay. You have a very long track record. A lot of this is perception. Here's an insurance policy. We're going to underwrite it for you. Here's your guarantee through an insurance mechanism. And then I go to the market and raise very interesting money. It turns out to be a beautiful story. Some of the MDBs globally start seeing this. 2 years later, I get a call from a global MDB that wouldn't touch me. And they say, we'd like to do business with you. And then they started giving me guarantees. And this is just an example of how this idleness thing is very real. Sometimes it takes Lloyd's of London to sit down and do a deal with me just to wake up all the others who are sitting too comfortably in their own zone.
Before I come to you, Samir was just whispering, I want to share my frustration point as well. And I think we're gonna listen to your point, and then I'm with you with a question. But please, what gives you a headache?
Very quickly. Look, in 2007-8, during the last big financial crisis, or thereafter, when Greece went down, I mean, we can take any incident. Let's take the Greece incident because it's a German panel, and German and Greece have a special relationship. And I don't mean it. I don't mean it tongue in cheek. I genuinely mean it. When Greece went down, on the day that the BRICS committed up to, I think, $50 billion collectively to support that particular moment, Greece still had a higher rating than any of the BRICS countries. So Greece was bankrupt, but the global credit rating and risk assessment system still would lend to Greece at a rate lower than it would lend to any of the BRICS countries. And this is an abomination. Now, I don't care who the regulator is. This is clearly financial racism, financial apartheid, financial, whichever way you want to, whatever term you want to choose. If I'm nice, I would say this is an error in thinking. But actually, it's more than that. This is a continuation of the colonial project of the 19th century into the financial sector in the 20th century. I think colonization died in the political realm. It did not die in the financial sector, because financial sector never signed on to the new order. Like the financial sector has not signed on to the Paris Agreement. All countries have signed on to the Paris Agreement in 2015, but the financial sector has not. So let us be honest here. There are fundamental problems with the regulator who decides the architecture of global finance. Greece cannot be more viable at the time when it went down than the BRICS countries who were giving $50 billion to Greece to keep it, to bail Greece out. So that is one problem. That's big frustration. Second, I think the whole framework of sovereign is rubbish. Now, I know why Greece was rated higher. Greece was rated higher because it was an EU collective and EU underwrote it. So I know the regulatory answer to my own question. But that and the Germans love that regulatory answer because that's the way they work. But listen, it's rubbish. It is not sellable to anyone outside of that part of the world. You lose credibility, you lose trust, and you lose any sanctity if that is going to be the answer. But let's assume that is a good answer. Let's assume, well done, it's a great answer. Now tell me, if Greece can be given a AAA rating, despite the fact that they are terrible in managing finances, have created a bubble that has brought down 1/3 of your continent, why is it that for climate action, which is a planetary challenge, which is a global challenge, if you do not put money into the African continent at scale, and let me say this clearly, 1/3 of future emissions, business as usual, come out of the African continent. If you do not direct 1/3 of all your money into Africa, Africa will burn your grandchildren's future. Finally they have a veto over your future. I'm saying this with all seriousness, that unless we all are able to pump 1/3 of global capital to the front lines of climate action, which is Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and other parts of the world, we are not going to respond to climate change. So why is it that why don't we projectize climate into in a manner in which we identify, say, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 500, whatever numbers, projects which are going to mitigate emissions? Why don't we actually put them under the EU sovereign rating, like you took Greece under yourself? Take these projects under the EU guarantee. No, I'm saying it with seriousness. So, you have the MEGA. Why don't we have MEGA on steroids, where continents that are responsible for the emissions that are burning us today actually underwrite, and I'm not asking you to underwrite our politics. I'm asking you to underwrite 1,000 green projects that are going to mitigate a significant amount of emissions. We have to think creatively so that we can decolonize the financial architecture which discriminates based on geography, color, and history. And there is no doubt in my mind that India is not more riskier than Greece. Greece only happens to be in the same geography and of the same ethnicity as the Chancellor of Europe, which is at that time Angela Merkel, and she served them well.
Thank you, Sam.
But sorry, my frustration. Sorry.
I hear that. Do a cleansing breath, breathing in and breathing out, but I do see it's a hot topic. And 90 minutes are never enough. I do feel that, because it is really a topic where the heart rate boils up. Thank you, nevertheless, for sharing your head up. No, it's a headache, but we are on the same journey. So I do have a microphone for someone in the audience. What's your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I know time is running out, so I'll be brief.
Easy. I'm the timekeeper, so please take it.
All right. So
when I do this is the neck.
I
No,
love
please.
listening to Samir. I mean, it's just great. I'm an economist, so I just thought this is like stand-up comedy for economists, and I just enjoyed it a lot. And it's very substantive. But my question goes to Admasu and other members of the IDFC, International Development Finance Club, because when you're talking about all these potentials and ideas and plans like hybrid capital or local currency financing and all these things are stuck and they can be unlocked. What's the role of the IDFC as a club of 26 banks, with a balance sheet of 1 point something trillion US dollars, in order to get it done? I mean, isn't it in the hands of IDFC to do something about that?
Thank you. Oh, can you pass on the microphone and then we start with that and then we take one after each other.
Yeah, no, it's
closer. So
yeah,
perfect.
It's a very good question. Fortunately, the IDFC has been quite proactive. We are discussing this, and there was an announcement at this COP where one IDFC member has now done hybrid capital with an African regional bank, and it looks like it's moving, but it's too slow. It's moving, and I'm very happy with the IDFC members on the credit line side. They've been very, very, how can I say, responsive. KfW has been very strong, AFD, and so on. But again, I mean, that's senior debt, right? And it's not really dealing with the real constraint now, which is on the equity side. We need that leverage. So I think this is where maybe the sovereigns, if KfW's owners don't like to see KfW doing hybrid capital, maybe this is where the federal government of Germany can sort of start listening and saying, well, maybe KfW should be given some room to do a little bit more hybrid over and above senior debt, and that would go a long way.
Okay. Let's have a quick response from Christiane and then to Uli. Thank you. And then who's the next question? Oh, yeah, over there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think a very valid point you're pointing there, and I think it all goes back to the systematic discussions we were just having here. How to start? I mean, let me make one other remark, because I was thinking all the time about this unlocking potential, and I think you were referring to the Lloyd's market, and we had yesterday a very good discussion with a couple of insurance companies, because there's another big pot of funds which is more or less untapped for Africa and Asia and developing economies. And the other part is, and there it comes to the regulation. I mean, that is true for the insurance industry as it is true for bankers. It is just the regulating bodies have, I think, a very formalistic view on regulation, which is on the one side part of their job to be doing that, But if you really want to unlock the potential of financial industries, including insurance companies and banks, I think there needs to be some advances on the regulation, and that has very much to do with risk perception as well, And just talking about our experience from, for example, DG, which is our private sector arm. The risk and the default rates on credits, on private credits and private engagements in Africa is as low as in any other country on the part of the world. But the risk perception of when DG talks to other private investors, including insurance companies, to join them on their way to Africa and to invest alongside is so far pretty reluctant. So it's a lot about risk perception, in particular when it comes to the private sector. In particular when it comes to the private sector in Africa. Sorry for diverting a bit, but still the systematic point of hybrid capital and all other, I think, is very, very important. And it all goes to the systematic ideas we were discussing today. And I think it's a very worthwhile question to put on.
Thank you, Christian.
Two quick points. One is on guarantees. So MDBs generally don't like guarantees because the internal rules stipulate that they're treated the same way as loans. So you give out a guarantee. Yeah, but I mean, who's setting the regulation for MDBs? This can be changed, and I mean, I think that ties back to the general World Bank MDB reform debate. I mean, we need MDBs to be much more proactive and much less cautious. And, giving a guarantee to a well-run, regional development bank, I mean, why do you need to hold 100% capital? I mean, this doesn't make sense. And with such a guarantee, you can actually make a lot of good stuff. And I've spoken with quite a number of leaders from national development banks, also regional development banks. They really think they can do a lot with such guarantees. That will enable them to tap markets much more cheaply. And the second point I want to make, and then I was not paid by KfW to make that, but I'm a bit of advertisement. But so DEG, so the KfW daughter, just recently exited the East Asian Development Bank, where it provided equity capital. And I spoke with the CEO of the East African Development Bank, and she couldn't be more appreciative of this involvement, because she said the equity that DEG provided was so important in really strengthening their institutional standing. And it's not only the capital itself, it's also the kind of, if you're a national development bank and you are backed by an internationally recognized strong institution, and of course that also comes with a seat on the governing board or whatever.
Yeah.
This really makes a difference.
And it made some nice returns for DG.
Christiane, would you like to add on something?
It made some nice returns for DG, because that's very important to mention, because I think we'll have to get in the space where we know this is a business case. If it's not, I think we will end up again in only thinking in terms of very narrow definition of development. But when it returns and it has an attractive return rate, then I think it accelerates much more movement. Sorry.
No, wonderful. One question, two questions. Please be very concrete and precise.
Okay. My first, I have actually two questions.
No, one question, because otherwise this other lady cannot get one question. One question.
Okay,
Decide.
one question only. Then I will cut it down to Mr. Flassbart. We are talking about resource mobilization globally and all the challenges related to that. And we also heard that still the developed countries are very important to unlock funding in other countries, and Germany is one of the key providers of international climate finance globally. But Germany also faces currently some challenges with resource mobilization due to a constitutional court ruling on the eligibility of some of the elements of the next annual budget. And when we talk to our international partners, some of them are concerned about the funding flows over the next years. What would be an appropriate answer to them on this special situation?
Thank you. We collect, and then I come back to you. And then the last question from the lady in the back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question would be related to the title of today's panel, as in what changed between the maybe no crisis, but monocrisis to polycrisis, as the frustrations you are describing were equally valid 10 years ago with the case of Greece, and the solutions would be equally applicable. So is it now easier to apply them? Is it now possible that it wasn't 5 years ago? What has changed? What these three or other crises that we can add to the list have changed? Thank you.
Thank you. Samir, please answer the last question, and then I come back to Jochen. Samir.
So on that part, I think we are more acute of the frailties of the system due to the polycrisis, and therefore there's an urgent need to act. I think there's a heightened demand as well as awareness of things not functioning today, and therefore finding ways of creating solutions. So I think that is a positive. The pandemic, in my opinion, I thought it was a moment when the world would finally understand systemic risk and would start understanding that responding to systemic risk is perhaps more important than responding to political risk. Mm-hmm. But I think the pandemic is now history, and we've gone back to the old ways, and we have still... So I think there's a frustration there also, that the pandemic should have made us more aware of responding to the climate challenge. We have gone back to now negotiating on whether my pension security, my pension insurance and other industrial activities are more important than climate action is. So I think it's both. It's a mixed bag. We are more aware, and yet we haven't done enough. So it's a mixed bag.
Because I already get in the back a lot of science, Jochen. We come straight to the question, of course, about the German household.
I can be very fast. It gives me a lot of headache at home, but globally, nobody needs to be concerned. I mean, the problems we are facing, compared to the problems we have to solve on the global level, it's nothing. You know, we have anyways a problem I outlined at the beginning, that with the budget support itself we will not solve the problems. So we have to broaden our scope, and I can already for myself take the conclusion of this panel. I feel even more encouraged to work on that part, that financial institutions, the financial sector, must not be seen as a separate area, but that we need to integrate it into our thinking. We have to enhance our own capacity to be part of the discussion, to be part of the game, and to identify where we can make a difference, to make your business easier, but also to challenge you where you might not deliver as good as you could. But even for that, we need to be capable to do so.
Thank you. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause for this very hot hour. Thank you to Uli Voits, Jochen Flassbart, Christiane Leibach, Patricia Oranjola, Admas Tadesian, Samir Saha, and I know you're already very busy, so let's have a great start into our Sunday. And come by, we have strong coffee. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching, and thank you to the audience in the live stream. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you soon again. Thank you.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP28 in Dubai. Ambitious, just together.